Week 5, Lesson 5, Seduction of the Innocent. Last video, we talked about the rise of EC Comics, where we learned about Bill Gaines and how he used violence, shock, and dark humor to turn his dad's struggling studio into one of the most successful companies of its time. The problem was, after the war, America was having issues with its youth rebellion. By 1950, the rebellious youth became a notable problem in America. Kids were not sitting still in class anymore. They were gathering in groups that they called gangs and going out at night. They would talk back to their parents, and they didn't like what their parents liked at their age, and they were on record as being more violent. Times were changing, thanks to the invention of atomic energy and the beginning of the Cold War. What youth wanted was different than what their parents did. This caused some people to investigate the cause, and for the purposes of this course, I'm going to talk about one of those people, Fredric Wertham. Fredric Wertham was born in 1895 and died in 1981. He was born to a Jewish family in Germany, but studied in England when World War I broke out. He was put into an internment there, where he read a lot of English literature. He studied psychiatry and even met Sigmund Freud, who helped him make the choice to specialize in his field. In 1922, he moved to the United States. He moved to New York in 1932 to a senior staff position at the Bellevue Mental Hygiene Clinic, where convicted felons were examined for psychological issues before being sent to court. In 1934, he released a textbook, The Brain is an Organ, which was the definitive textbook on brain psychology at the time it was released. He did several studies that showed that segregated schools were hurting children's mental health. These studies were brought up in Brown v. Board of Education, which helped end segregation in American schools. In 1946, Wertham founded the La Farouche Clinic in Harlem. It had a multiracial staff, which allowed black and white kids cheap or even free psychiatric care. So looking at his career up until this point, this guy seems like a really decent person who wants to help out people, especially the poor and underprivileged children. This man would soon go on to become the most hated man in comic book history. I would even go as far as to say that Fredric Wertham would become one of the most influential men in comic book history who never wrote, drew, or published a comic book. The issue started innocently enough, as America's youth was starting to become more rebellious, and Wertham wanted to help solve the issue. Talking to the juvenile delinquents in his clinic, he realized that a surprising amount of them had been reading crime or horror comics. This should not have come as a surprise to anyone, as some studies showed that more than 90% of children in America were reading comics during the late 40s. But the majority of youth Wertham was talking to were ones that had gotten into trouble. So, even though 99% or more of the kids reading comics weren't getting into any trouble, Wertham wasn't dealing with them. The other thing to keep in mind was that Wertham didn't grow up reading comics. This was still a new medium, and until he talked to the kids, he probably didn't read any comics outside of newspaper strips. So, he wasn't used to them or had any gradual exposure to them. This is how he connected things in his head. He was a rebellious youth growing up, and he didn't have access to comics. The youth in his clinic were rebellious, and they all had access to comics. Therefore, comics were the problem. On May 29th, 1948, in the Saturday Review of Literature, he wrote an article called The Comics, Very Funny. It was a 5-page article that talked about the terrible things youth did to get sent to his center. He talked about how a girl was tied up by her brother and tormented. He talked about how a 20-year-old killed a cop, about how some boys burnt a girl's breasts with cigarettes and carved their names in her back. And he linked all these together with the perpetrators of the crimes having access to comics. He called comics the marijuana of the nursery and explained that the negative aspects of them far outweighed the positive ones of the medium. Many parents wanted a scapegoat to blame for their children's negative actions, and comics seemed like a good enough target. Violent comics weren't around when they were kids, and it's easy to side with a respected psychologist that comics were to blame for everything bad that the children did. That way, it wasn't the parents' fault. It wasn't the educational institution's fault. It was this new medium's fault. By October 1948, 50 American cities planned to censor or ban comic books. Los Angeles set a $500 fine for anyone who gave or sold a comic depicting crime to a youth under the age of 18. This became so bad that by 1949, the U.S. Army Character Guidance Council wanted to stop sales of certain comics at the military bases. They recommended that bases don't sell comics that went beyond the line of decency. Many comics elsewhere were banned for being too violent, but it would have been too ironic for an army to ban violent images, so what went beyond the line of decency mainly referred to sexual acts. New legislation led to multiple burnings of comics around the country. Parents and students wanted to show that they were against violent comics, and started burning them. Starting in the schoolyard, students began to burn single issues of comics. This was probably done under some sway from their parents. Rumson, New Jersey, a cub master got his troops to collect all the comics showing violence or anything sexually suggestive to be rounded up and burnt, although at the last minute they decided to hand the comics to the Salvation Army to use as scrap. In 1948, there was a comics burning in Binghamton, New York, and Cape Girardeau, Missouri. There was a clear backlash growing against the violence in comics, and all this happened before the rise of popularity of EC comics. Today, it's nearly impossible to tell how much, if any, of the controversy that Fredric Wertham's writing inspired. But, as the controversy grew, he definitely benefited from it. So much so that he wrote a book about the dangers of comics in 1954. This book is one of, and possibly the most important book on comics ever written. And, as you might have guessed by the title of this video, it was called Seduction of the Innocent. Fredric Wertham made it by taking a look at some of the studies he had from talking to the youth in his center, and by the comics he read himself. He found a few things. The most understandable of his findings was that comics promoted racial stereotypes, especially with the Japanese and Asians. They were usually shown with yellow skin and either fang-like or buck teeth and unrealistically squinty eyes. He claimed that comics were a bad influence on girls. The female heroes were always getting tied up or tortured in some way. The girls of the romance books were shown in a very bad representation of love and always seemed dependent on a man. He found the way that women were drawn in some comics would cause sexual deviant behavior in some boys. Some of his patients even collected pictures of illustrated women for masturbation purposes. He even went after the ads, saying that they made dubious claims like ridding kids' faces of pimples or letting them lose weight quickly. Most other things in the book seem to be a bit of a stretch. He claimed that Superman supported the Nazi myth of Aryan ideals, and he claimed that Batman and Robin were a gay couple. He came to this conclusion when a gay patient of his, who happened to be a young boy, admitted that he had fantasies where he was either Batman or Robin, having sex with the other. The lack of pants on Robin's suit was also a giveaway of his sexual perversion with Batman. But the idea of a boy going into a cave with a fully grown man who he wasn't related to train and investigate crime didn't help, especially when that boy didn't have pants. Wertham never took into account the reason that Batman didn't bring any girls to the Batcave was because he was a giant kid at heart, and girls were icky. And Batman acted as a father figure to Robin, not as a sexual partner. The Superman example is completely off. Superman is an alien with black hair, not a blonde-haired, blue-eyed human from Earth. It was a very one-sided approach to comics, but because Fredric Wertham had the title of doctor in front of his name, his views on comics had a lot more influence in the public than the people who actually wrote or read comics. Now, since Wertham is dead, it's impossible to tell for sure why he wrote what he did. His heart could have been in the right place, or he could have been blinded by his hatred for the comic book industry. We'll never know. However, in 2010, Wertham's research notes that he used to write the book became available to the public, and it was discovered that Wertham's research between comics and juvenile delinquency was baseless. So, why is Wertham important to this course? Because he's one of the most infamous critics of comic in the history of the medium. His writing helped to promote the negative backlash against comics, and his title of Doctor of Psychology helped legitimize the view that violent comics were damaging to children. Questions to contemplate. Excluding comics, What do you think could have been some of the reasons for the rise in American juvenile delinquency in the late 1940s and early 1950s? Do you think Fredric Wertham deserves to be one of the most hated men in the history of comics?